Hello, everyone. The topic of my talk today is going to be about innate immunity, and more specifically about the contribution of innate immunity to herd immunity. Herd immunity primarily against acute viral infections. So SARS-CoV-2 is an acute viral infection. And so what I am going to tell today is not going to be just specific for SARS-CoV-2, but in principle applies to all acute viral infections. And the reason we are interested, of course, in herd immunity with regard to the current pandemic is that we think that by generating sufficient herd immunity, we are going to get rid of this pandemic. And I think this is the end goal of the vaccinations that have been initiated, that have been rolled out and have been brought up to speed in many, many countries by now. So it is, I would say, critical to very well understand the contribution, the importance of innate immunity as a contributor to herd immunity, as without that understanding, I think is simply impossible to understand what is going on right now in this pandemic. And it's also impossible to understand how to handle this pandemic best. So as you all know, I think the way it's handled right now is scientifically not adequate. And I think part of this comes from the fact that people do not realize the critical importance of innate immunity to herd immunity in this pandemic. So I've made a couple of slides to visualize my thoughts and my insights on this, and I would like to share them with you, and I will give some explanations along as we move forward with the slides. So I'm going to try to share my screen with you. There we go. And then, okay. Okay, so the title of my talk is Innate Immunity is the cornerstone of herd immunity against acute viral infections. So first of all, to talk about, to explain a little bit what I mean by innate immunity, I really mean the effectors of innate immunity as opposed or in contrast to the effectors of adaptive immunity. So innate immunity, the effectors of innate immunity are B cells, and those B cells are B1 cells. I'm not going to go into much detail, but B1 cells, they secrete natural antibodies. And we are going to see immediately what are the specifics of those natural antibodies. So there is the humoral component of the innate effector part of the immune system, which are the natural antibodies. And there is also the cellular component. And the cellular component consists of NK cells. So these are natural killer cells. So natural antibodies, natural killer cells. Those really constitute the first line of immune defense. And natural antibodies are in fact pre-programmed. They are fast. They can immediately react. They can immediately come into the play and, for example, neutralize viruses. They have a very interesting feature in the sense that they are non-specific. So they are characterized by low affinity for antigens. And therefore, they can interact in a non-specific way with multiple pathogens, multiple antigens. So, for example, as it comes to COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, these natural antibodies are capable of neutralizing a large spectrum of variants, of COVID variants, and even a broad array of coronaviruses. Natural immunity typically has no memory, so that means that you cannot recall these antibodies by bringing in contact with an antigen that the immune system has previously seen. And there is, this has, or these characteristics do have a few consequences. First of all, because the natural antibodies have to be able to deal with several different pathogens, they can only deal with a relatively low load. For example, in terms of viruses, a relatively low viral load. So you can imagine if you have to deal with several different enemies at the same time, there is only so much energy you can spend on one single enemy. So they cannot deal very efficiently with high loads of viral particles, and the same applies to bacteria, for example. The other disadvantage, so to say, is that this immunity is not permanent. So as we grow older, for example, we will have less and less innate antibodies, natural antibodies. And also people who, for example, have weakened immunity or gets immune suppressed, their level of antibodies, natural antibodies, will also drop. So it's not an immunity that, so to say, is 100% reliable, as there is a number of factors that can diminish the concentration of these natural antibodies. On the other hand, so I'm not going into the detail of what natural antibodies can really do, but as far as SARS-CoV-2 is concerned, there is evidence indeed that this type of antibodies can perfectly prevent SARS-CoV-2 particles, viral particles, from interacting with AC2, with the AC2 receptor on susceptible cells, respiratory epithelial cells. And I put on my website a lot of, frankly speaking, I think very, very interesting publications about innate antibodies, natural antibodies, and what they can do. And it's also very clear from the content of these publications and other references that the way these antibodies bind to viral particles, for example, is very, very different from the way antigen-specific antibodies bind to viral particles. So they bind with much less affinity. This binding is based on multivalent interaction. So it's very, very different from an antigen-specific interaction. And on the other hand, there is also a lot of evidence, I would say, that these antibodies are indeed capable of neutralizing a vast array of different variants within one and the same viral species. So this has particularly been shown, for example, for influenza virus, where several different scientists have shown that natural antibodies are capable of neutralizing and dealing and protecting against a number of several different influenza strains even. So in contrast to this innate part of the immune system, and I'm talking really about effectors, these are effector cells like B cells, like cytotoxic effector cells, we have something similar on the adaptive side. We call this the acquired or the adaptive immune effector cells. They consist of B cells as well and T cells. So now the B cells that secrete, so to say, the antigen-specific antibodies are B2 cells, but it's a little bit more complicated than this, but I'm trying to simplify. So it's a different part, if you like, a different type of B cells. And then, of course, also we have the T cells. So it's also important to say that B and T cells, just like the B1 cells and the NK cells, they can also synergize. By synergizing, so for example, antibodies are capturing antigens or particles and or then introducing them into antigen-presenting cells. And these antigen-presenting cells patterns that are presented on these antigen-presenting cells can then be recognized, for example, in the case of innate immunity by NK cells. In case of adaptive immunity, specific antigens after antigen uptake, processing, and presentation or then presented to, for example, T cells, could also be cytolytic T cells that can then kill also the infected cells. So there is this kind of synergy is a little bit similar between antibodies and the effector killer cells, be it cytolytic T cells for the adaptive immunity or NK cells for the innate immunity. And so the difference, of course, is that all these things, whether it's neutralizing by the natural antibodies or killing by the NK cells, this goes very, very fast, can be done at a very, very early stage of infection. Whereas with regard to the adaptive immunity, it all takes time because the antibodies need to be generated, to mature, affinity maturation, etc. So this is a slower process. And with regard, for example, to cytolytic T cells that can really kill virus-infected cells, well, this is more often the mechanism that comes to play when people got already infected, got the disease, and then can cure out the disease thanks to these cytolytic T cells. So the combination or the B cells secreting antigen-specific antibodies, those are antigen-induced. So this is very, very specific. It's not like all kinds of, well, all kinds. Also, the natural antibodies do not recognize all kinds, but they recognize patterns that are shared amongst a number of different pathogens, whereas the acquired antibodies, so to say, they do this in a very specific way, in an antigen-specific way. So they have a high level of specificity. This is due to their high affinity. And this system, the adaptive immune system, does have memory, which is, of course, very, very interesting, because thanks to the memory, the response, the specific response, can be recalled very, very fast, and is very, very reliable because the memory is there. And if the organism or the host gets in contact again with the antigen, it can immediately target that antigen. It can immediately, the immune system can immediately concentrate its full energy on that specific antigen. And that is also the reason why the adaptive immune system can cope with a high viral load. It does not need to tackle the different enemies at the same time. When it gets recalled, it's immediately there. It's immediately focused on the invading antigen. And that is, of course, that has, of course, a high advantage. So that is also the reason, I would say, why we vaccinologists are excited about vaccines. If you can prime somebody, and this person now has an immunological memory, when he or she gets again in contact with the antigen or with the pathogen, the immune system can be immediately reactivated in the right way, specifically directed at that specific antigen or pathogen. And this is very reliable. Even elderly people in the older ages, this mechanism, this memory is still there and can, with almost like the same efficiency, be recalled to tackle the invading pathogens. So as we grow up and as we age, we come in contact with more and more and more pathogens, and therefore progressively, the adaptive immune system is like dominating the innate immune system, because it comes, of course, then more and more important to deal with several different pathogens in a very efficient way. And there are some limitations for the innate immune system. In fact, for the adaptive, there is only very, very few limitations, but there is one important limitation also for the adaptive immunity. And that is that adaptive immunity, as you can read here, is very, very specific. So it's not going to be possible to recall your adaptive immune response with exactly the same efficiency against another pathogen or an antigen that is not the same or very similar to the one that has originally induced the memory. So I think it's important to, and this is one of the slides that I showed my presentation in Ohio in March of this year, just to illustrate how antigen-specific antibodies are interacting with natural antibodies. And I'm giving here the example of the most prevalent natural antibodies, the IgMs, that are multi-antigen specific, as I said, whereas the IgG, the acquired antibodies are antigen specific. So these are two viruses. The one is the original SARS-CoV-2, and this is an infectious, highly infectious variant. So those are have not exactly the same antigenic features. So I guess what I'm trying to illustrate here is that specific antibodies, antigen-specific antibodies, can bind with high affinity to the antigen that the antigen that has originally induced these antibodies. So for example, if you make a vaccine and you use, in this case, spike protein or parts of the spike protein that are the same as those of the original circulating SARS-CoV-2 strain, and you immunize with those vaccines, then you can achieve a very, very strong immune response against these original SARS-CoV-2 strains. And this is a binding with very, very high affinity. Affinity is going to be less good if you have a variant, if you have a viral particle, which is still pretty similar, but not exactly the same, certainly not with regard to the antigenic constellation of the S protein, which was the protein, remember, that we are using in the vaccines. But so it may well be that, for example, this binding with high affinity is still completely, well, more than sufficient, of course, to not only bind to the spike protein, but to really neutralize it in a sense that the strong binding will prevent this viral particle from interacting with the AC2 receptor on the respiratory or epithelial cell. Whereas if the antibody has lower affinity, it may still bind, but not necessarily still be able to neutralize the virus. But in any case, regardless of the strength of binding to these SARS-CoV-2 particles, original or variants, the binding of this antigen-specific IgG, because it is specific and therefore has high affinity, will always be stronger than the binding of a multimeric natural antibody to these particles. This multimeric antibody binds with the same strength to these variants because it's a completely different principle of binding. It recognizes patterns on these viral surfaces and not specific antigens. And so it's important to realize that if you induce antigen-specific antibodies, which is, as I was saying, fantastic because you can target your pathogen in a much more specific way, well, then it is important, it's very, very important that the specificity targets really the pathogen that you want to eliminate or that you want to neutralize. Because if it does not, let's say you have a variant that is pretty different with regard to its antigenic constellation, it will still bind, but no longer neutralize. And then you cannot say, yeah, but I'm still having my natural antibodies there that can help to do the job that this low affinity antibody cannot do. No, this is finished because these guys, the antigen-specific antibodies will bind still to the variant, to the spike protein, and by doing so, these antibodies will outcompete the natural antibodies for binding to the pathogen. So once you have induced those, you can no longer rely on your natural antibodies. Well, this is of course an extreme case. They outcompete, but this outcompetition, this outcompeting activity is in many cases, of course, not 100%, but there is a strong advantage for these specific antigens to interact with the particle compared to the natural antibodies. So in other words, if in other words, it is key when you induce antibodies against your pathogen that you do it in a way that is very, very specific. Because if it is not, if the specificity is not optimal, if it is suboptimal, then you may have a problem in the sense that the antigen-specific antibody is no longer capable to completely neutralize the viral particles. And those particles that are no longer completely neutralized can no longer be fully recognized by the IgM natural antibodies, because the antigen specific, or at least to some extent or to an important extent, outcompeting them. So I guess what I want to say is that there are a number of conditions under which one generates suboptimal specific antibodies, and now I'm talking about SARS-CoV-2 more specifically, but in the meantime blocks natural antibodies. So if you generate specific antibodies in a way that is suboptimal, that's not going to be very profitable, in a sense that you may not neutralize or completely neutralize your virus, but you do block your antibodies, your natural antibodies, sorry, to some extent. So when does that happen? Well, for example, let's look at natural symptomatic infection. You can have an infection, and then afterwards, for example, your specific antibodies will decline. If you have a high infectious pressure, it can well be that during this decline, you get reinfected with the virus. And when antibodies are declining, their titers may no longer be sufficient to neutralize the virus, but they may still be sufficient to outcompete your natural antibodies. So you're ending up in a situation where your body, your immune system, can no longer really deal very well with the pathogen. And at the same time, your natural immunity is suppressed. So that is a case where you could even end up upon a reinfection after a first natural infection with a more severe disease because of the suppression of your innate immune system. And these things happen. We know that these things happen with SARS-CoV-2, for example, where people get reinfected after a number of weeks or months and do more severe disease than upon the previous exposure. It can also happen during asymptomatic infection. Remember, I've said this a number of times in my talks and in the literature, that when you get infected in an asymptomatic way with SARS-CoV-2, so you don't have any symptoms, for example, a fair amount of those people, they will end up with suboptimal antibodies. They eliminate the virus very, very fast. Most likely, I would say this is, in fact, for me, it's proven that it's due to NK cells, so not due to antibodies that appear later in the process. So, but there is some kind of recognition. The stimulus didn't last very long because the virus was eliminated within just a few days. And you have some suboptimal antibodies that are really not very mature. If during this stage, these people who got asymptomatically infected or sitting on the suboptimal antibodies get reinfected with a virus, this is a kind of similar situation as the one that I described before. These antibodies, as I was saying, are suboptimal, will not do a good job in neutralizing the virus, but they will suppress and to some extent outcompete the natural antibodies. So these are cases, for example, where people who got asymptomatically infected upon reinfection get, for example, severe COVID disease. A third situation is a situation where somebody is seronegative, has no antibodies, no specific antibodies. So I mean seronegative for specific antibodies. And these are people, for example, that we are vaccinating. So they get their first shot. What happens after the first shot, especially in the first days after the first shot, they start mounting antibodies. These antibodies can, of course, at that early stage not be fully mature and not reach very high titers. But if the infectious pressure is high, for example, during a pandemic, they can be reinfected just a few days after they got the first shot. And these are typically the cases where people do severe disease, COVID disease, after the first shot. Why is this? Well, again, the same story, suboptimal antibodies, but affinity is high enough to bind to the S protein and hence outcompete the natural antibodies. So their natural immune response is completely, or to a large extent, suppressed. So all these conditions of suboptimal immunity, they can predispose to immune escape. I'm not going to explain again what immune escape means, but it's clear that if you have suboptimal immune responses in a large part of the population, why in a large part of the population? Well, because you're vaccinating a lot of people who are seroconverting, who have to wait for their second dose, for example. And at the same time, you have a lot of virus around. Well, then some variants that appear spontaneously can get trained because they encounter this unfavorable suboptimal situation very frequently. They can be trained to replicate and to propagate in the presence of this immune pressure. And hence, this is what ultimately will make viral variants very, very fit, and will enable them to propagate at high levels in the population. But it's not only predisposing to immune escape, the suboptimal conditions will also occasionally lead to severe disease, as I just explained. So mass vaccination in the midst of a pandemic leads to selection and adaptation of more infectious variants, that's what I just said, and ultimately resistance to vaccinal antibodies. So I've forgotten vaccinal there. So it needs to be resistant to vaccinal antibodies, but whilst blocking natural antibodies. So how does this work again? And I think this mechanism is very, very important to basically understand how the curves of infectivity, of disease, etc., evolve in several different countries. So when you have mass vaccination, first of all, you increase the circulation of more infectious variants. So what I'm saying is that, first of all, well, we were already seeing a number of infectious strains that were circulating before really we started the mass vaccination. So these infectious variants, they got a competitive advantage when we started mass vaccination, because mass vaccination is inducing immune responses, of course, against the S protein of the original virus, which is not the same of the variants. And so you give these already present variants a competitive advantage. But even if you don't do so, the fact that for example, you have people, when you start mass vaccination, who start seroconverting, who are waiting for a second dose, for example. And because these vaccines do not completely protect against transmission, you will always have some leakage. And because the suboptimal conditions are present in a large number of vaccinees, you may start to see the occurrence of infectious variants. And because more infectious variants are going to start to circulate, or are already circulating, but now due to this competitive advantage, due to the immune pressure by the vaccination, they will all of a sudden take over all other strains and become completely dominant. So anyway, the result of that is that you increase the infection rate in the population. So the virus, so to say, becomes more infectious because there is more infectious variants that are predominantly circulating. So what does that mean? Well, if the infectivity rate increases, then of course, the likelihood that somebody who got previously asymptomatically infected and is sitting on suboptimal antibodies gets now in contact again, so re-exposed to the virus, becomes higher and higher. So there is a higher likelihood for re-exposure of previously asymptomatically infected carriers. So that will explain already, while now in a number of these asymptomatically infected carriers, you will have a wave of disease. So all of a sudden, in a fairly substantial amount, of these carriers, the natural antibodies will be suppressed, will be outcompeted to an extent that that makes them susceptible enough to get a disease. So that is where all of a sudden you will see a wave of disease in these asymptomatically infected carriers. What you see after this wave is immediately a quite steep decline in the infection rate in the population. So why is this? Well, the remainder of the asymptomatically infected carriers, they still have sufficient antibodies, sufficient natural antibodies to withstand, to resist the infectious pressure. And so they will still be able to resist the infection. And because they are asymptomatic carriers, so the infection rate will dramatically drop. So they will still, based on their natural antibodies, they are still sufficient to resist the infection. So the infection rate will dramatically drop. But when that the infection is still now being transmitted within this population of the asymptomatic carriers. But as I was saying, the infection rate dropped dramatically. So this is the time where the virus is going to select more infectious variants. Why is this? Well, I was saying these asymptomatically infected people, they are, after asymptomatic infection, they are raising antibodies that are suboptimal. So the virus can still replicate in those people, but their natural antibodies are still sufficient to prevent disease, no problem. But there is some immune pressure that is put by those asymptomatic carriers on the S protein of the virus. Why S protein? Because the antibodies they mount, suboptimal antibodies, are directed against the S protein. And so variants that arise, but that will be able to overcome this pressure, will have an advantage. And we know that these type of infectious variants are variants that select mutations, especially within several different domains of S protein, that increase the effectivity of the virus. And that is primarily due to the fact that the anti-S antibodies, the suboptimal anti-S antibodies generated by these asymptomatic carriers, have pretty low affinity. They are not fully mature, as I said, and they are directed against several different domains of the S protein. So while the infectivity rate is relatively low, the virus is encountering suboptimal conditions in a reservoir of people that are now sustaining the replication of this virus, namely the asymptomatic carriers. And you will see that after a while, you have more and more of these variants circulating. And frankly speaking, that is what we have seen since the mass vaccination got implemented. Since we implemented mass vaccination, all of a sudden, we have seen many more infectious variants arising. And this is pretty interesting or strange because, for example, during a natural pandemic, for example, the flu pandemic of 1918, you didn't see such a thing at all. So the pandemic went through with 3 waves spread all over the world, and still there were no variants with higher infectiousness arising. So here the situation is very, very different. So as we have circulation of more infectious variants in vaccinees, you will have selection and adaptation of resistant variants in the end. Why is this? Well, first of all, when you have more infectious variants circulating in the asymptomatic infected people, then of course, because this becomes now a pretty limited reservoir of people. Why? Because more and more people get vaccinated. So, and we vaccinate people who have no symptoms. So more and more of these asymptomatic carriers become now vaccinated. And so if the virus wants to propagate and to persist, in fact, the virus needs to adapt to the immune situation and the immune pressure put by the vaccinees. And in fact, the immune pressure put by the vaccinees is very, very similar to those put by the asymptomatic carriers that were non-vaccinated. Because remember, their immune response was directed against several different domains in the S protein, whereas in the vaccinees, the immune pressure that is put is essentially against the receptor binding domain, because that is the domain that is targeted by the antibodies, by the vaccinal antibodies, but it is also still within the S protein. So in fact, because those antibodies have higher affinity than those of the non-vaccinated asymptomatic carriers, what the virus now simply needs to do is to overcome a somewhat higher pressure, because these antibodies now of the vaccinees have higher affinity to prevent the infection. But as I was saying, the situation in the vaccinees is oftentimes suboptimal because, first of all, there are more infectious variants circulating. So the recognition of the vaccinal antibodies that are directed against the original virus compared to the S protein now of the variants is pretty different. So you have a kind of heterogeneous situation where antibodies that in fact do a fantastic job against the S protein of the original virus are now suboptimal because they do not fully recognize or not sufficient, they do not sufficiently recognize the S protein of the variant. That is one thing. Second, plenty of people are vaccinated, are mounting antibodies, seroconverting, others are waiting for the second dose, etc., etc. So you get now more and more selection, in fact, and adaptation, because many, many people are in this situation of variants that are going to overcome the binding affinity of the vaccinal antibodies to the S protein. So when that happens, of course, you will have an enormous backlash, and you will have a wave of disease, no longer, of course, in the non-vaccinated asymptomatic carriers, because there are very few of them left, but now more and more in vaccinated people, so in vaccinees. It is often said, well, mass vaccination prevents this. We had, and I will show you examples of mass vaccination, where mass vaccination coincided, in fact, with the wave of disease, with the peak. So some countries like Israel, like the UK, they have started their mass vaccination at a moment in time where the peak was at its summit, so to say. So that was a kind of coincidence. It's not like, and I will show you in some of the slides, that this mass vaccination that occurred at that very point in time was the reason that the infection pressure was decreased within the next 2 weeks. If we look, for example, at the curves in countries that did not start their vaccination at the very height of a peak, for example, India, Canada, Brazil, Uruguay, etc., Chile, what you see is that a few weeks after mass vaccination started, not 1 week, several weeks, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, depending on the speed also of vaccination, you got a steep increase in infectivity. So in some countries, there were already highly infectious variants circulating, like in Brazil, Chile, Uruguay. It was the Brazil variant. So there, the basic infectivity rate was already pretty high. When you then come with your vaccination, you give this variant a tremendous advantage, and it really explodes. Whereas in other countries, this was much less the case, and they had a much lower basic level of infectivity. But still there, at the same time, approximately several weeks after mass vaccination, you saw these infectivity rates going up. So here, it took very, very little time because the infectious variant, the Brazil variant, was already well prepared to go off. Whereas here, because of the low infectivity rates in India, for example, and in Canada, it took much longer before, and the curves, they increased up to a level that was lower, like, for example, in comparison to Chile or for example, Uruguay. So if we, next slide, look, for example, here, that's what I meant. These three countries, Israel, United States, and United Kingdom, they started vaccinating really at the very peak, at the very summit of the infectious wave. And within a few weeks, in fact, yeah, within 2 weeks, they got a very steep decline. For example, in the UK, they got a decline. I'm looking here at the figures. Over 3 weeks in the UK, here is the UK, 3 weeks, there was a decline of 50%, whereas I had only, at that point in time, that was in January, they had only vaccinated between 3.5 and 10% of the population, so over that whole month. And so very, very few people had, and only one dose, and you got almost immediately a very, very steep decline. Whereas remember, in Chile, after the same time, they had been vaccinating 40%, for example, of the people. And even then, they still didn't see any decrease in the infectivity curves. On the contrary, the curves went up quite dramatically. And you see the same in Israel, because in Israel, they also were vaccinating at the very height of the peak. And when they vaccinated, I'm just looking here, they got also a steep, within the next weeks, a pretty steep decline, and was also in January. And at that time, they had vaccinated 25% of the population. So the difference was seen very, very fast, much faster than any difference that was seen in the countries that were not doing mass vaccination at the very height of the peak. And again, even then, Chile, 40% is even much higher than the vaccine coverage rate that was noted in Israel by that time. It was only 25%. So 25% was sufficient, so to say, to see a very steep decline also in Israel within a few weeks, whereas 40% after several weeks in Chile just resulted in a steep increase in the effectivity rate. So let's for a moment look at what is the difference between a natural pandemic and the current pandemic. The current pandemic, which is characterized by stringent infection prevention measures and mass vaccination. So in the natural pandemic, the nicest example is, again, influenza 1918. There were no, this was wartime, no infection prevention measures or negligible, I would say, and certainly no vaccination, let alone mass vaccination. So what you saw there, and in yellow, I put, in fact, the columns represent more or less the herd immunity of the population. But the yellow part is the part represents the vulnerable people. So in the flu pandemic, 1918, you had a certain part of people who were vulnerable and were immediately affected when this new virus came in and who got the disease. So there was not a lot of hygiene measures, not a lot of any kind of infection prevention. One has to imagine this was during World War I. So it was not a situation where people had a lot of luxury. And obviously the virus spread pretty fast. It spread so fast that a number of younger people who had been asymptomatically infected during this first wave, which affected primarily vulnerable people, lost their natural immunity, or in other words, the infection or the infectivity rate was so high because there was little control of the spread of the pandemic that a number of asymptomatically infected people sitting on suboptimal antibodies got reinfected before they got rid of the suboptimal antibodies. And that may have been responsible for severe suppression in a large number of these younger people of their innate immunity, so that they got the disease. And we saw a severe wave of disease, especially in younger people, that is indicated by 2. But then we even saw a third wave, and it's very interesting to note that, of course, the international traffic was not like today. So you first had this thing developing in Europe, and then later on it came to the Americas. And there, obviously, again, you had a third wave, which may have been the result of some vulnerable people that were still living on the other continent that had not been touched by the pandemic so far and that were vulnerable. So it was in fact a repeat of what had happened before. And again, this infectivity rate may have increased to an extent where, again, in some of the asymptomatic carriers on that other continent, was suppressed, so that you saw a little bit of even a fourth wave. And let me have a look at the next slide. So this is the first wave, the second wave, primarily in Europe, and then you see this third wave, which was probably a repeat of the pandemic in the Americas. So this kind of peak, and then a little bit of a fourth peak. I'm not saying my interpretation is fully correct, but at least it could have been explained by this phenomenon that when you're sitting on suboptimal antibodies, your innate immunity can be suppressed and you become susceptible really for the disease. So, but then when the pandemic comes to an end, what happens? Well, you have a kind of equilibrium where people who got the disease, of course, have now their antigen-specific antibodies. So they are good, they are safe. So the part, in fact, that got here eroded of the innate immunity, because all these people, that's why I'm saying innate immunity is such an important component of herd immunity. When the virus comes in, 80% or 85% of the people, depending on the composition of the population, is naturally protected thanks to their natural immunity. So that is fantastic herd immunity. It gets eroded though when the infectivity rate increases. I've explained this, but then this part that got eroded gets now, in fact, compensated by antigen-specific antibodies, because people get the disease, they mount serious amount of antigen-specific antibodies that will protect them. So now you get this kind of equilibrium between people who still have sufficient natural antibodies to protect them against the virus, and then others who previously got the disease and are now also protected thanks to their antigen-specific antibodies. So the herd immunity has now a little bit of different composition, antigen-specific antibodies on one hand and natural antibodies on the other. But of course, things evolve, and as the population will age and as several things will happen, some people will start to lose their natural immunity. Remember, as I said at the very beginning, natural antibodies are very interesting. They're multi-specific, but they are not 100% reliable, because if you get, for example, immune suppressed, you age, you get underlying diseases, for example, your innate immunity will diminish. And that will be, these people, when they lose their antibodies, or when they have not, they don't lose them, but they don't have sufficient antibodies anymore, then they become again vulnerable. And again, this part of the population that you can see here that has no longer sufficient antibodies turns in fact to this zone. This should now be yellow because they become again vulnerable. And that is how you can get an outbreak on the background of a very good herd immunity. So with the pandemic, this is completely different with the current pandemic. So as I was saying, we have the vulnerable people. That's where the virus came in. These people started, of course, spreading the infection. To some extent, we had already highly infectious strains circulating before the mass vaccination got rolled out. So we had already a pretty high infectious pressure. I think that due to the mass vaccination, the highly infectious strains that were already circulating, or the more infectious strains, they got a boost because they got a competitive advantage due to the immune response mounted in the vaccinees. And hence what you saw is all of a sudden, I've shown it on the curves, in countries that vaccinated outside of the peak, you got a huge increase in infectivity. And there, of course, you had a number of previously asymptomatically infected people who saw their innate immunity suppressed, a huge wave of disease, but then the natural immunity in the other asymptomatically infected people is still sufficient and will block this infection. So infectivity rates will go down. But then as you further, of course, vaccinate, and as the asymptomatic carriers that resisted are still the carriers for the virus, because that is where now, when you vaccinate, you have no longer a lot of virus spread in the vaccinated population. It is essentially now in the asymptomatic non-vaccinated, and they have now an opportunity by the phenomenon that I explained before, because of the suboptimal antibodies with low affinity that are directed against several different regions of the spike protein. If that evolves, then you can again have more infectious variants that can possibly repeat this phenomenon. They are now mounting the infectious pressure in the population and can now suppress the immune pressure, the natural immunity in the remaining part of the asymptomatically infected. But that depends on how fast the mass vaccination progresses. Because if the mass vaccination progresses very, very quickly, then the remainder of this asymptomatically infected carriers will be a very minor part of the population, because these are the people who get vaccinated. So you will have more and more circulation of the virus and adaptation, according to the mechanism that I explained before, in the vaccinated people. Now, in these people, the virus need to overcome the pressure of the antibodies. And I was saying the infectious variants were already doing very well, because they were already overcoming pressure against the S protein. Now the immune pressure by the vaccinees is more specifically on the receptor binding domain, but as many of these vaccinees are in suboptimal conditions, the virus can overcome this, and I'm sure the virus will overcome this, and that will lead to resistance. So now what has happened is that you have eroded your natural immunity in large parts of the population, and when resistance comes, then you will also destroy the adaptive immune response that has built in this population, no matter whether they have been vaccinated or naturally infected. They have this specific antibodies. So when you get resistance, all these people now become susceptible. So here we have no equilibrium whatsoever between antigen-specific and natural antibodies. We have erosion of natural immunity. That is because of the infectious variants that have all continued to suppress the innate immunity in the previously asymptomatic carriers, up to a point in time where mutations have been selected that were now able not just to overcome infectious pressure on S protein, but really to overcome the pressure on the receptor binding domain, leading to resistance, which is of course a catastrophic situation. So just to summarize this, so when you have antigen-specific antibodies, they suppress innate antibodies. It's not a problem if the antigen-specific antibodies are perfectly functional. That's a great thing. But if they're not perfectly functional, you have a problem. So, for example, if you have the original virus, this is perfect, high affinity of these antigen-specific antibodies, much lower affinity of the innate antibodies. So you're better off with your antigen-specific antibodies. If you now have, for example, a variant, and I'm now talking about antigenic drift, because people very often compare these variants to, they say, yeah, look at flu, etc., etc. I mean, flu could be a similar situation, but there we are talking about a phenomenon that is completely different. If you have a variant flu, as we have like almost every year, this is what we call the antigenic drift. Well, what will happen is that these variants have not been selected to be more infectious, and therefore, I mean, your innate antibodies will still work. They will not be suppressed in people, but the antigen-specific antibodies will work less well. So you may have a small wave, especially, of course, in vulnerable people. When we compare this to the immune escape variants that are more infectious, this is a completely different situation. Although, and people may say, yeah, you know, the genetic differences are the same. You're still at 98 or 98.8 percentage of similarity, or 1.2% or 0.8% of difference. So in terms of genetic differences, yes, But these variants have now been selected during mass vaccination campaigns to be more infectious. And because of the infectivity, they are capable of suppressing innate antibodies in asymptomatically infected. And that is what is a dramatic thing here. You see this minus, the antibodies are suppressed in a substantial amount of people. That is also the reason why here you will have a big wave. The antigen-specific antibodies can recognize, as well as they do this viral variant with less affinity. But here, this is the reason why you have now a big wave, and especially not in the vulnerable people, in the elderly, but in people that are much, much younger. These were the people who were best protected against the disease, during the previous wave. So this is, according to my interpretation, the result really in infectious variants of mass vaccination and mass prevention infection measures. So more infectious variants trained by S-directed immune pressure cause dramatic disruption of herd immunity. So a more extreme example is, so this is the previous example where I was talking about more infectious immune escape variants. I just put this on this slide again for the sake of comparison. But if now you have, for example, resistant immune escape variants, of course, they are even more infectious. They completely resist the antigen-specific antibodies. So you have here a complete negative. But because of their very strong binding now to the S protein, they can even much better overcome the innate antibody response of the asymptomatically infected. So they are going to suppress much stronger the innate antibodies in asymptomatically infected people. So here you will have a huge wave, and this huge wave, as I explained, because it is affecting now also people who are have been immunized, whether it is by natural infection or by vaccination. So this will cause a really big wave. And frankly speaking, and I'm really I feel very sad about it. I feel completely devastated about this. But I'm pretty sure that is what we are going to see in countries where resistance will occur. And I think resistance is going to be inevitable. Big waves in previously asymptomatically infected people as a result of mass vaccination and mass prevention infection measures. So yeah, okay, if we compare this, because this is substantial change, so to say, a substantial, when you have all the modifications, the mutations, when the virus becomes more infectious, then on top you may have these important mutations in the receptor binding domain. So here we are talking about much more important genetic variation, something in terms of the degree or the level of genetic variation. You could maybe compare this to an antigenic shift, for example, of influenza, not a drift, but a shift through recombination, etc., where a completely different piece, so to say, is inserted into the genome. And again, the antigen-specific antibodies will not recognize. But here, because they are not selected to be more infectious, your innate antibodies will still work. And the wave may be bigger than in case of antigenic drift, but it will still be much less pronounced than the huge wave you will see as a result of resistance that occurred during mass vaccination campaigns in pandemic. So to summarize this, innate immunity, adaptive immunity, mass vaccination with current vaccines in the midst of a pandemic lead to suppression of innate immunity, and that is primarily due to selection of more infectious variants, to giving more infectious variants even a higher competitive advantage. And ultimately, of course, if you have resistance, it has, of course, it abolishes your adaptive immunity. But sorry, I must say, in a first stage, you have not, of course, resistance, but you have higher infectious variants that are recognized less well, of course, by your vaccinal antibodies. So you have a negative effect on the adaptive immunity. That was what I meant here. So these variants are less well recognized than the original virus. So, but then as things evolve, you have more infectious variants, you come to resistance ultimately. Well, then, of course, you have a dramatic negative effect. Your antibodies don't work anymore. And you have even higher higher pressure on the innate immunity, higher depression, so that they are more suppressed, a higher level of suppression on your innate immunity. So the consequences of the COVID-19 mass vaccination campaigns, well, you can see that at the start of mass vaccination campaigns, they led within 1 or 2 months to really a dramatic increase in cases, except of course when the start coincided with peaks such as in the UK and in Israel. So in other countries, as I was saying, within 1 or 2 months, you got really very steep, huge increases in cases of infectivity. You got also a dramatic, since we started mass vaccination, a dramatic and fast increase in the number and the level of infectiousness of the more infectious variants. Again, this is completely unprecedented. I gave you the example of the flu influenza 1918, where no variants were even seen during the whole pandemic. So on top, what we also see since mass vaccination is that we have enhanced convergence of selected mutations, really more specifically to the receptor binding domain of the S protein. And then we also see an increase in, I call this super spreading events, where, for example, virus comes in, people are vaccinated. They may not have gotten severe disease, they become mildly ill, etc. But within just a few days or just a few days, you spread the virus throughout all of the community. That is what has been seen, for example, in elderly homes and nursing homes. And now you also start to see an increase in the number of partial or even full resistance cases that are reported. So there is an increasing number of cases that have been reported now in the media and that relate, in fact, to people who have been injected twice, have been the full vaccination regimen, and that got severe disease. So all of this, for me, clearly points to the fact that mass vaccination combined with the stringent infection prevention measures is really, really, really driving higher rates of infectivity, higher rates of disease, all due to immune escape, which gives rise to more infectious variants and ultimately resistance. And you can ask yourself, well, what has this to do with the goal of the mass vaccination campaigns? Well, because how does this relate to the growing herd immunity and that we were expected from mass vaccination and control of highly infectious variants? None of this is seen, and I think this is a really, really a dramatic contrast to what we are really seeing, which are the things that I have highlighted under these bullets. So, well, how to remedy? What can we do about this? Well, in case of a natural pandemic, I think it's very easy, but we are no longer dealing with a natural pandemic. You have these highly vulnerable people here. Well, the infection comes in, these people are vulnerable. We need to take care of these people. We need to treat them in a very early stage. And since they are often in like long-term care facilities or nursing homes and elderly homes, the infection will spread very, very rapidly. So it has no sense it doesn't make sense to vaccinate. What I think do make sense is to extend the early treatment, not only on people who have the disease, but at all the people in that community, to immediately, effectively and dramatically diminish the infectivity rate. As far as the asymptomatically infected or the healthy people, I would say, who are protected, concerned, to the extent that they are, well, they of course will, the virus will circulate in this community, but as long as they have a good natural immunity, And as long as they avoid things like crowding, especially, you know, in rooms with bad ventilation, etc., outdoors, I think it's acceptable. But if they are have good innate immunity, so good health and good lifestyle, and we have already been talking about this, and on top they avoid crowding, they will be able to control this virus. Because remember, the major source is this one. And we, of course, need to avoid spread from this reservoir as much as we can. We cannot always, because some people need to work there. And nurses, people who take care of the elderly, for example. But still, when the virus will come in, and we will not be able to avoid this because SARS-CoV-2, for example, or we would not have been able, is shed by people who are asymptomatically infected. But provided you boost this innate immunity, or you have this innate immunity at a high level, you avoid things like supercrowding, etc., the population should be able to deal with this. And of course, from time to time, you will have a case. Remember, as I said, some people may be infected or reinfected just, you know, a short while after they got asymptomatically infected. They get a new infection while sitting on suboptimal antibodies. But that is something which you typically have when you have a good herd immunity, as you have here, and you have an outbreak, okay? So in the case of the current pandemic, I think we have no choice. We have nothing left here. We need absolutely, I don't think there is anything else we can do to vaccinate asymptomatic carriers. If we would, let's say, we had already the highly infectious variants before the mass vaccination started. Those highly infectious variants, as I tried to explain, were primarily circulating in asymptomatic carriers. So at that moment, it might have been sufficient to just immunize, vaccinate those people, but definitely with vaccines that provide sterilizing immunity. And those who get ill, same as in the vulnerable, to treat them at an early stage for their own benefit and for the benefit, of course, for the community to diminish the infectivity rate. Now that, or once you have a lot of people vaccinated, and certainly when you have people who will ultimately become resistant to the vaccines, then you have no choice but you have to vaccinate everyone. I think although the cases of resistance are not clear-cut yet, but I am sure, unfortunately, I mean, I have tears in my eyes when I say this, but I'm sure it will happen in Israel and in the UK, but as long, even already now, because so many people are vaccinated there, we should intervene with vaccines that eradicate the infectious variants. And of course, if resistance will come, and if those peaks will appear, then everybody will say, well, yeah, it was not a very good thing to do the mass vaccination. And revaccinate them will not make sense because we'll simply recall your old antibodies, which have memory, and those antibodies don't fit at all with the new variants that come or with the resistance strains. So that will not help. But then everybody will, of course, acknowledge, yeah, we must eradicate these strains, and then this would need to apply, of course, to all people, not only the asymptomatic carriers, but all the vaccinees. So what is the summary of this? Well, I hope I have shown you that the importance, I forgot some words there, how innate immunity must, it should read, how innate immunity, of course, is a cornerstone of herd immunity, how innate immunity is weakened by increased infectivity rates, and that is, of course, due, for example, in the current pandemic to the enhanced circulation of more infectious variants that was already going on before we implemented the mass vaccination campaigns. How the erosion of the innate immunity is compensated by adaptive immunity during a natural pandemic, so that's great. How the protective equilibrium establishes at the end of a natural pandemic. So you get this kind of, you know, a natural equilibrium between the two arms of the immune population immunity, and it's protective. how mass vaccination, however, in the heat of a pandemic, first puts innate and then adaptive immunity out of business. The current experiment, I mean, none of these things, and especially not the critical importance of innate immunity, has been taken into account when this experiment was started. This is exactly how one would proceed to generate highly infectious variants that ultimately resist the vaccines. What would you do? Well, you would start off already with variants that are more infectious. That's what I think we have been doing by global implementation of the stringent infection prevention measures. And then these infectious variants, you can very, very easily breed them to make them more dominant in the population, because as soon as you start vaccinating with antibodies against the S protein of the original strain, you give them a competitive advantage. And by doing this mass vaccination, putting everybody, no, not everybody, but many, many people under suboptimal conditions, with the virus being permanently around during the pandemic, you generate a kind of breeding ground for these variants to become more and more infectious and ultimately resist to these high affinity antibodies directed towards the receptor binding domain and induced in the vaccine. So at this stage, I think emphasis, P is missing there, P is missing there. Emphasis should be placed on early treatment, in-house serological self-testing. I think the most safe thing right now is to make sure you are seronegative. You have no antibodies against S, because the antibodies you may have, it's increasingly unlikely that they will still work against the highly infectious variants that we are facing. And they suppress your innate immunity. So the best thing for me is to make sure and to have a kind of in-house testing system, a kit, a finger prick test or something like this, where you could assure that you're negative. Because if you're negative, you know your innate immune response, your innate antibodies are not suppressed, and they can deal literally with all kinds of different COVID variants, even including coronaviruses. And then, of course, we need to really seriously to think about immune interventions that enable eradication of this virus. Thank you so much for your attention.